The passage on which the message is based is Daniel chapter 1. You can follow along on page 935 of the Blue Bibles. Hear now the reading of God's Word. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him to not defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with just lost my place, sorry about this. And deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in visions and dreams. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord.
As we start this new series, I should probably mention you're going to be hearing more from the church in the weeks to come about MTW, that is our mission to the world, mobilizing some teams to go down to Florida. Teams of 6 to 8 people are going to be working to do cleanup, stabilizing homes, chainsaw work, tarping, roofing, debris removal, removing sheetrock, in other words, it's gutting and mucking. If that's something you have a passion for, gutting and mucking, and there's nothing better than a good chainsaw, I've got God's will for your life. See me later, and we can talk about what that might look like. Dr. Brian Chappell, the stated clerk for our denomination, the PCA, tells the story of the wife of one of his students back when he was a professor at Covenant Theological Seminary. Like wives of many seminarians, this woman, Karen is her name, Karen was earning money to keep her student husband in school and food on the table. And in her case, Karen made her living as a quality control inspector for a major pharmaceutical company. One day, through some faulty practices, the automated machines used to manufacture syringes failed. so that the syringes themselves became contaminated and therefore failed inspection. And so Karen reported this problem to her boss, but he quickly computed the costs of reproducing the order and made a cost-effective decision. Because so much money would be lost in replacing the syringes, the boss ordered Karen to sign the inspection clearance despite the contamination. Karen refused. But because of certain federal regulations, only Karen could sign those clearance forms. If Karen didn't sign, the syringes couldn't be marketed. The boss urged and threatened Karen, but Karen would not budge. This led to something that had never happened before to her. It led to a visit from the president of the company to her cubicle. And he also had computed the costs of reproducing the syringes, and he issued his decision. The forms must be signed. You've got to sign the forms. Karen would have the weekend to think it over, but the president told her that if she was still determined not to sign the forms on Monday, her job would be in jeopardy. But in fact, much more than that was in jeopardy. It wouldn't just be Karen's job, that this was the family's only means of income. It was a well-paying job. It wasn't easily replaced by another job. Her husband's education and their family's future, as they saw it, was endangered by this. Their hopes, their dreams, the career plans that they had could be shattered as a result of this choice that she would have to make. For this young couple, all the theological and doctrinal instructions about sanctification and righteousness and holiness suddenly came down to this one concrete decision. Could they as a family afford to remain undefiled from the contamination of worldly business practices that were now pressing down on Karen to approve? What would you do? What would you do if it was your decision? You see, there's nothing new under the sun. This first chapter of Daniel illustrates that there have always been pressures on God's people to compromise their faithfulness, to compromise their holiness. So this morning we're going to look at preparing for the book of Daniel. This is our first sermon. If you're here visiting today, it's a great time, great place to sort of jump in. This is the first in a new series. Second, we're going to look at what it means to prepare for holiness. Can you prepare to pursue holiness with your own life? And then finally, also preparing for divine blessing, because that's in here as well. So let's sort of prepare for the book. Let's have a little introduction about what we're going to find. You're going to be very happy about one aspect of our series in Daniel. Our series in John lasted 2.5 years. We came up just 6 months short of the actual length of Jesus' actual ministry. Then did you feel like you practically walked with him? We spent almost 3 months in the upper room alone. He only spent one night there, but you got 3 months, okay? So as we open up this book, by our best guess, think about this. Daniel is probably a 14-year-old boy. By the end of the book, Daniel has aged about 70 years and is in his 80s. Now, you know me. I'd like to go through this at just that pace. But I myself am 62. I had to make some cuts. So if we go according to plan, we will end by May of 2023. Next May. All right? So, what was Daniel's world like? Right? You remember at this point, Israel is divided into two. After Solomon died, about 150 years before Daniel was born, Israel had split. Right? There was the northern kingdom and there was the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, to put it charitably, was a wreck. The 10 northern tribes that made up the northern kingdom never really managed to have any kind of faithful foundation for pursuing the Lord. Not one of their kings was what you could call a righteous man. Not one. They were so weak that they ultimately fell into the hands of the Assyrians in what today we call northern Iraq. But on their heels, on the heels of the Assyrians, it was the Babylonians. The Babylonians took over and conquered the Assyrians. And so now they, at the time of Daniel's birth, are the ones that are in control of this part of the world. And what you'll find is a continual theme that will continue throughout this book, and that is that nations and empires, they rise and they fall, they come and they go. But all of it happens by the hand of our ever-sovereign God and our ever-sovereign and present living God. It just go down the list, empire after empire. All these empires, they all think they're going to last forever. Egypt, Greece, Rome, the British Empire, Austro-Hungary, the Third Reich, and let's not forget Israel under David and Solomon. None of those kingdoms, none of those empires stands today. Some of them are buried feet under the ground, under dirt and dust and clay. And hey, some think that this country is in late empire decline, spiritually bankrupt, with our days numbered, and perhaps another kingdom will come along and take over for this one. There's no guarantees. When the Babylonian Empire ascended, it started to expand rapidly. And on your reflections page, you can see how the Babylonians, a little map there, how the Babylonians cart off the remaining two tribes of the southern kingdom. That's the event, in a sense, of verse 1. Verse 1 recounts the beginning of that process when Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, defeats Jehoiakim, king of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, and starts plundering it. And Daniel's being taken away, that's part of phase one of a sort of three-part plundering that Nebuchadnezzar does from Israel. And it's during the first phase of these attacks that Daniel and his friends, they're picked up because they are the best and the brightest. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes to Jerusalem. He besieges it. And he takes Daniel and his friends and presumably many others of the best and the brightest. And these early verses give us the dates, the reigns, who's king at what time, the lands that we're talking about. It recounts observable facts. If you had a smartphone back then, you'd know this was 605 BC, and the headline you'd see on your news feed would be Jerusalem falls, and the little picture over the headline would be a picture of Nebuchadnezzar. The point is, this is rooted in history. These are facts. This is likely why, of the three main sections of the Hebrew Bible, your Old Testament, the law, the prophets, the writings, Judaism puts Daniel not in the prophets where we find it in our English Bible, but with the writings like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Judges, Ezra, Nehemiah. It's a historical book. And even the latter half of the book, the apocalyptic visions that we'll get to, they're visions of future history. But something else is at work here, and you heard it 3 times when Micah read for us chapter 1. Look at verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. That is Nebuchadnezzar's hand. God is at work in history. Not just our history, but the history, the workings of the whole world. Verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion. Verse 17, God gave Daniel and his 3 friends learning and skill. That refrain, the Lord gave, God gave, that comes up again and again and again in this book. You'll hear it over and over. And it's especially important to notice for 2 reasons. First, like we've already said, these are historical facts. But it's history by the hand of God. It's history by the hand of God. Like a rhythm track, you're going to see the recording of a historical event, and then you're going to hear the Lord decreed it. Historical event, the Lord did it. Historical event, the Lord gave this to Daniel and his friends. Over and over. God is in control. But the second, and just as important point is because of where God is active. Because of where he's active. He's active in Babylon. In Babylon. There's a God in Babylon. The God is working there. He's ruling and he's reigning. He's reigning over the kings of the earth. And that's where he's at work. Now, likely next week, Stephen will be preaching next week. Likely next week, you'll learn more about Babylon, which was the superpower of its day. But notice today what it says in verse 2. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he, Nebuchadnezzar, brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Now this is really interesting, because as Valerie read for us, the land of Shinar was the very place that the Tower of Babel had been built. The place and event where the peoples of the earth got together to conspire against God. Babel, that place that became Babylon, is where Daniel, his friends, and even the vessels of the tabernacle have been taken to. Those symbols, these are symbols of the very presence of God. God is giving his treasure, his covenant people. These elements that are supposed to depict his presence in the temple. He's just giving, he's placing these things into the hands of people who never left Babel in the first place, who now worship their own God, who's called Marduk, at the place that symbolizes the empire of evil on earth. God has done that. Why does God do this? Why does God do this? God is not to be the source of evil. Why would God, it almost looks like he's defiling himself, doesn't it? Why would God allow his covenant people like Daniel and signs of his covenant love and presence to be carted away to a place of historic evil where for 1,000 years since the Tower of Babel had been built, they've been worshiping a false god? If you flip over to chapter 9 of Daniel, if you're using the Blue Church Bibles, turn to page 948. If you flip over to chapter 9, Daniel will tell you why. Daniel has always known why. Look at chapter 9, verse 9. This is in Daniel's very famous prayer, right? To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him and have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God by walking in his laws, which he set before us by his servants, the prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. Now, what Daniel's pointing out here is that way back in Deuteronomy, this very thing was promised by God. That is, if Israel would go after other gods, if Israel would chase after other gods, Israel would be taken out of the land. And now, here they are. They're out of the land. The blessings then of a theocracy, being a nation, the singular nation that had been guided and protected solely by the Creator God who is love, that is officially ended. That's the context of this book. They're out of the land. They're out of the place of blessing because they followed after other gods. And now, Daniel and his friends seek to remain faithful to their God, who is managing, this is amazing, he's managing to discipline his covenant people and judge the enemies of his covenant people and uphold and protect and save his covenant people all at the same time. And it's amazing as we go through the book how God can be faithful to his covenant love and also bring evil to an end and lift up his people who are suffering under the hand of a foreign king, even as they are judged for lack of faithfulness. Well, I hope that prepares you to drop down now into this book. Let's now zoom in closer to the text we have before us. Our second point is preparing to pursue holiness. Preparing to pursue holiness. A few of you may have some familiarity with the sociologist James Davison Hunter. A number of years ago, we had a doctoral student here at Hope that had studied with him at the University of Virginia. Hunter is a sociologist. I have to tell you, I don't like reading sociologists. I don't like reading sociologists because I don't like reading charts. However, Hunter is a rare bird. He's a world-class sociologist. He is one who's read closely by religious people, the secular people, academics on the right and the left, and Hunter is a Christian. And you all likely know at least one thing that he wrote many years ago, because this is the guy, this may be the evil guy you may think, this is the guy that came up with the phrase, the culture wars. He coined the term to describe the fact that both in the East and in the West, while there are different shades or multiple perspectives on issues, there really is a culture war between, Hunter says, a generally secular value system and a generally religious value system. So whatever religion you are, there's a culture war between the predominant religion in that place and the predominant secular religion. Well, yeah, secularism in that place, which some would call a religion. And while I really don't like the phrase culture war, and I hate using it because of what it brings to mind, you know, all the shouting voices and all the talking heads that just shout, it seems, forever, it's hard to say that he's wrong. Whether it's an ethical issue in the culture, something like abortion is a big issue today, a social issue like, you know, what is the purpose of our public schools, or a political problem like whether we should help in a foreign war on the other side of the world, or climate change. I want you to hear me. I am definitely not preaching any one position on any of those things at the moment. But I am saying, note the reality of it. Note the reality of the war that goes on over each and every one of these issues. Note the reality, but also the fact that there is nothing new under the sun. Daniel is a person, like many of you, a person of faith, living in a world of unbelief. And he finds that his worldview goes against the secular powers of his day and age. Okay? And Daniel will literally have to fight off the lions, you might say, of a secular worldview. But we have to be very careful here. We have to be very careful. What some Christians do is they actually themselves enter into the culture wars, and to do so, they use the weapons of this world. They enter into the culture war not with necessarily God's truth on their lips, but with the weapons of the culture wars. What I mean is, Christians all over the world read this passage, read the book of Daniel, whatever language and place they're in, and they think that they too are fighting for the soul of their individual nation. And to enter the fight, they end up preaching politics also. They use politics also. They meet secular politics with what they think of as Christian politics. In fact, I get many emails from ministries that want to help me as a pastor, to help you as a Christian, to better fight the culture wars by giving you political positions. They want me to tell you how to vote. They want me to make sure you know the right position on a whole bunch of topics. But, and I hope you've noticed this, that's not what we do around here. What we do, what we should do at this church, what we should seek from God is how to learn to live godly lives in whatever culture, whatever workplace, whatever home the Lord has you in. To live steadfast lives for the Lord based on a firm foundation. If we live lives based on a firm foundation, if we're exemplary, not just in things like our prayers, our prayer life, or our knowledge, but across the board in things like our character and our loves, then we will be salt and light in our homes. We will be salt and light in our workplace. We will be salt and light in our culture. Now, how did Daniel prepare for this? How did Daniel live his life? You know, even as a 14-year-old boy, there's no indication that Daniel is some kind of special, like, one-off savant. Like, only Daniel could do this, right? He's just a very godly young person. Probably at the top of his class at Hebrew High. But some of you are at the top of your class as well. So how did he do it? Right? There are some things, notice, that Daniel never does. Daniel was not an activist. This is interesting. Many of our secular schools, many of our Christian schools seem to be training young people to be activists. But that's not Daniel. Daniel is a young man. He never marches on Babylon. Right? By the way, I'm not saying that you can't march on or march for something. I'm not. I'm only pointing out that Daniel never did. And I don't think any of us can imagine the radical difference that it must have been to live his life as a young Hebrew in Jerusalem and then living his life as a young Hebrew in Babylon. Now, some of you are from different countries, and you're living here in the States, and of course, this can seem like a very different place. But I dare say the difference isn't greater than what Daniel experienced. And here's why. Here's why. Everything that Daniel had been taught to hate, everything that Daniel had been taught to loathe and avoid and reject, were the things that were epitomized and exalted in Babylon. And these guys, Daniel and his friends, they're just kids. They're just kids. They're 13 or 14 years old, and yet Daniel shows how people who worship the one true God, the living God, can live, work, and survive, even flourish in the midst of a nation, a culture, and a government that are hostile and sometimes life-threatening. Friends, the wisdom to do this does not develop overnight. You can't just be in one of these situations and like summon up the wisdom to be faithful all at once. It doesn't start overnight. Nor is it created, by the way, in a vacuum. It is the mature fruit of lives and characters that have been forged by experience, by tests, by trials of the providence of God, and faithfulness and obedience to Him. Let me say that again. It is the fruit, the mature fruit of lives and characters that have been forged by experience, by tests and trials, all under the providence of God, and by faithfulness and obedience to Him. You who are here in the room who are parents, do you discuss around the table some of the challenges that you may have in living faithfully in your work or in your vocation? Do you have those conversations, or do you kind of hide them because you want to sort of protect your kids from them? Do you at least try to have them? Do you pray together as a family and for one another about the challenges that you're going to face in a world where there will be pressures on you to be something other than the person you've been raised to be? Look at verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs, the chief official, to allow him not to defile himself. Daniel proposed in his heart that nothing he did would displease God. Nothing would ever have a place in his heart above the Lord. He engaged his mind, he engaged his will, and said that nothing that displeases God is going to have a place in his life. You know, if you were to label this with a biblical label, it would be the fear of the Lord. Right? The fear of the Lord. Now, fear of God is sometimes thought or taught that you are to be afraid of God, that God is mad and he's bad and he's looking to do some nasty things to you. So if you're smart, you'll be afraid of God and just do whatever he tells you to do. That's how fear of the Lord often sounds. But fear of the Lord is not a servile fear. It's not that at all. It's not a walking on eggshells around God kind of thing where he's always watching you. It's rather what I'll call a loving fear. Not that he's not watching you, but it's a loving fear. Let me illustrate this from marriage. When you're dating somebody, there's a kind of fear when you're dating that kind of can be destructive. A fear that the other person will see some flaw in you, some blemish in you, some behavior that would so turn them off or repulse them that if they knew this about you, if they saw this on you, that would be that. Relationship over. And you kind of are walking on eggshells. Any date could be the last one that you have with this person, right? But when you're married, the fear is that they're going to see those flaws, those blemishes, those behaviors, and you simply don't want to repulse, hurt, or sin against them. There was a part of me on my wedding day that said, phew, I'm just glad this dating thing is absolutely over with, right? We're finally one. Don't have to worry about that. But I have to admit, there was a new fear on my wedding night that I would say or do something, and my wife would say, I made the wrong decision. Now that I see him as he really is, I made a mistake. Get me out of here, But you see, now it was a loving fear. We're living now inside of a covenant promise, and this wasn't fear so much of rejection, although maybe you worry about that a little bit at first, but rather that I would let her down, that I wasn't pleasing her or a blessing to her. And likewise, because Daniel wants to now please and honor God in his covenant relationship with his Lord, he chooses to live distinctly for God. He doesn't want to let God down. Parents, again, have you given your teenagers the wisdom to do this? Sinclair Ferguson, in his commentary on Daniel, has a section on this chapter regarding the power of the culture, and he actually calls it brainwashing. Now, when you read that sounds pretty drastic, doesn't it? It sounds kind of alarmist. And then you realize the copyright of this commentary is 1988. And Ferguson makes the point that Nebuchadnezzar has a plan here. The plan is to have Ashpenaz retrain Daniel and his friends in the ways of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, you see, he's taking the long view. He knew that to overcome God's people by military force wasn't going to be enough. He knew that if the Jews he captured continued to resist him, his efforts to subjugate them would demand more and more and more of his time and resources. And so that instead of strengthening his position in the world by attacking Israel, he would be weakened by them, because suddenly there'd be all these people that he was now over control of, and they would all push back at him. So what does he do? He takes the best and the brightest, and he assimilates them. He weakens Israel by stealing away and exiling the cream of the crop. And he gives them a thoroughly Babylonian education. What better agents could he then use in his future dealings with Jerusalem than to always have in the meeting their former best and brightest who are now speaking on his behalf? Ferguson writes, this is back in 1988, Nebuchadnezzar was not the last leader to see the value of infiltrating the colleges and universities to find candidates for his future service. Now, I hope you see the point. If we don't catechize our youth, the world will. It's one or the other. Right? If we don't catechize our kids, the world will. If I don't feed myself on the Word of God, it's not as if I'm just in some floating neutral place. No, the world will feed me what it wants me to think. That's why Daniel won't eat or drink what Nebuchadnezzar gives him. He wasn't an animal rights activist. He wasn't on a diet. He wasn't worried about whether Babylonian food was too spicy for him. No, he knew what the Babylonians do. They take their food and they offer it first to idols. Then they eat it, and whatever's left over goes back to Nebuchadnezzar. That's Babylonian life. And this isn't some silly thing. Just like when we eat the Lord's Supper, as we're about to do, it's not silly but powerful that when we take the supper, this meal is communing with our God. That's how we think of it. Feasting with the true God of grace, in grace. Well, likewise, Daniel knew that to eat the king's food in this setting would defile him. To commune with, to unite with the pagan god Marduk. So Daniel knew that in this culture, in this setting, to eat this meal would defile him, and it would be to deny the real God, the true God, Jehovah, and who he really is. He had to make a choice. There was no in between, no neutral place. Again, notice what Daniel doesn't do. He doesn't contextualize his faith such that the truth of his own faith is made void, right? He doesn't say, well, when in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do. He doesn't do that. No, he prepared for this. He knew enough. He'd been catechized by his family, and now he had made a study of the Babylonians through the education that he's been getting in exile, and he sees beyond the food that's on the plate to know that to eat this meal will bring displeasure to God, and he says no. Now, I need to move on to our last point, but just one point of application here. Saying food is just food, that doesn't work for Daniel here. And when you're on the internet or on your phone in a dark room, saying that bodies are just bodies, that's not going to work either. Context is everything. And you have to look beyond those images to what those images actually mean. In one context, in God's covenant context of marriage, to have and to hold is good, right, and beautiful, and it's a gift from God himself. In the context outside of marriage, it is to disconnect sex from love. As Paul says, it's to unite yourself to a prostitute. So just as eating was not eating for Daniel, watch out when somebody says love is love. Sex is sex. Is it? Really? Go back to what you know. Go back to what you've been taught. Is it good? Is it something that the Lord gives, that God gives for his glory? Or in this culture, is it to take and enjoy for my own glory? You have to know the difference. Finally, briefly, preparing for divine blessing. There is a psalm that comes from this period in exile when God's people were dispersed, when they were displaced. And it's Psalm 137. Pastor Stephen preached on it last Sunday evening. There's a place in the middle of the psalm where the psalmist says this, by the waters of Babylon. So recognize the context. Babylon. Very place we're talking about. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion, right? When we remembered home. On the willows there were hung our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of those songs of Zion. The psalmist then says, after recounting how the Babylonians forced them to assimilate and capitulate and then shame and mock God's people, the psalmist says, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Now, what's so interesting here, what's so interesting about the book of Daniel, is that Daniel never seemed to have a problem singing the truth, speaking the truth, living by the truth of his faith. From day one, Daniel knew how to be in exile in Babylon. From day one, he plants his flag in the ground. You could say that his usefulness in the kingdom of God and his faithfulness throughout the rest of the book depends on this first single decision. This one moment. Later when we get, to things, other challenges, other tests and trials, like the lion's den, or the test by Nebuchadnezzar to interpret his dream, well, he wouldn't have had those opportunities if he isn't faithful here. If he blows it here, he won't have the ability to fight later on. For those unbelievable tests of faith that are to come, he had to have resolve when he needed it, because he was resolved and faithful from the beginning. From the beginning. Now again, we'll talk more about this in coming weeks, I'm sure, but the Babylonians had techniques that they used to assimilate and enslave people, and I just want you to have your own antenna up for these things in the culture as well. The first thing they did was they isolated Daniel and his friends, right? They took him out of the context where he was safe and enjoying life and worshiping God, and they dragged them off and away. Second, they indoctrinated them with their stories and their myths. He didn't just learn their language, right? He learned their stories. He learned their culture. And then third, they confused their identities. They confused their identities. It's just one example. Daniel's name means God is my judge. Right? You probably even know the L of Daniel. It's like Elohim, like the Lord, right? Well, God, El is my judge, Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar changes that to Belteshazzar, meaning Bel is my commander, or Bel protects me. Now, Bel was one of the gods in the pantheon of their gods under Marduk. They did this, you see, with each of these young men because they were assimilating them. They changed their identities. They changed their names. So with this isolation, with this indoctrination, with this name and identity confusion, the great power in the world at that time was saying to Daniel and his friends, you need to forget who you are. You must forget who you are. You need to forget who you were raised to be. You need to forget the God who made you. Literally, you need to forget that your God alone is judge. Now, the God of Babylon is your judge. But we must not. We must not assimilate. The reason that Daniel could make that first decision, the reason that he would not forget in the midst of that first onslaught of what Ferguson calls brainwashing, and in this ultimate of culture wars, will you follow Christ? Will you worship a false god? Is because of what God gives in God's divine blessing to Daniel. Over and over, remember, God gave, the Lord gave, God gives. The point is, this is God's story. The point is, this world is the Lord's world. The point is, you're the Lord's, see? Daniel and his friends, you could say they write checks, right? They tap that debit card and tap into their faith, knowing that God gave them this faith that they can use, that God gave them life, breath, and everything else that they would need. And so no matter what or how much Nebuchadnezzar might do to make Daniel his own, and a part of his story, his role, it's God who makes Daniel a master of the Babylonian text. It's God who gives Daniel understanding and wisdom. And as we'll see, it's God who gives Daniel visions of what God is doing in history and in the midst of the rising and falling of nations. The point is, God gives us grace. God gives us grace and everything we need to live in the world that he has us in, no matter where you are. It's not like the world took you somewhere that you cannot live for Christ. That is impossible because he owns the whole world. He's in control of the whole world. Not just of what we're doing in this room on a Sunday. He's active in Babylon. He's active everywhere. And when you believe, when you trust, he will give you all the skill and knowledge, all of the wisdom and vision that you need in this life. Brothers and sisters, be faithful in the small things. Be faithful early and often in your life. If you're a young person, decisions that you make now have impact down the road. If you've veered off early on, it's just easy to stay off. Keep veering off. Keep moving away. So be faithful early and often in your life. And later, when something big is demanded of you, you'll know who you are. You know, Karen, the wife of that seminary student, that she wouldn't sign those clearance forms for those syringes, and she was forced to leave her job at the pharmaceutical company. But God did bless her, because the company that ordered those syringes called her company up and said, "Where are they?" And they said they'd been delayed. And so they did their own little investigation and why they'd been delayed. And they found out about Karen. They found out that there was an employee who wouldn't sign it and protected them from getting defiled syringes. And so what they did was they found Karen and hired her, and she got a nice raise out of it. Now, that's not going to happen every time you obey. It won't. It won't. What I can tell you is there is, though, a greater Daniel. There is another king that out there that would try to isolate the King of Kings. He actually snatched the King of Kings away and tried to kill him. Religious leaders tried to indoctrinate him into the teaching of the Pharisees, and they tried to confuse his identity by saying that he's the devil. But for you and me, Jesus Christ remained faithful. Trust in him. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you for this new book that we get to study. May we enjoy going into its riches week by week. Lord, show us how we've assimilated. Show us where we have maybe given into the ethics, the culture, the aesthetic, sometimes the humor, sometimes the lies of what is Babylon today. Show us where we become too acculturated, too assimilated, too conformed in our beliefs, in our practices, maybe too assimilated in our hearts, because we just think it's too painful or too embarrassing to be known as Christians. And show us, Lord, that all that fear should be taken away, that if we only have fear of the Lord, that if we only know you as the mighty God who is Lord over all, who, as Pastor Stephen pointed out early, loves us and has redeemed us and brought us to himself, if we would see you that way, we would know that you are worthy always to be trusted and to be worshiped. In Jesus' name, amen.